Trump loves the idea of absolute power. He said he would be a dictator on day one of his second presidency. That's what he said if he gets reelected. He's constantly praising Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un wherever he gets a chance. He likes the fact that in Kim Jong-un's place, his people stand up for him. And he doesn't hide his desire to exercise extreme power. I mean, every day he says it. Listen to what he said at a roundtable event in Florida while trying to court Latino voters.
As president, you have tremendous, it's called extreme power. You have extreme power. You can, just by the fact you say, close the border, and the border is closed. That's it. Very, very simple.
It's sort of funny when you think about it because, like, he was president the first time around and that didn't happen. But it really isn't so simple to federal law, again, because there were lawyers who said, like, no, you can't do that. But again, the aspiration is there. Whether the lawyers will be there a second time around, who knows? All this has real-life implications, as Vice President Harris warned voters of that threat earlier today.
He wants a military who will be loyal to him personally, one that will obey his orders even when he tells them to break the law or abandon their oath to the Constitution of the United States. In just the past week, Donald Trump has repeatedly called his fellow Americans the enemy from within, and even said that he would use the United States military to go after American citizens. So the bottom line is this. We know what Donald Trump wants. He wants unchecked power. The question in 13 days will be, what do the American people want?
Sherrilyn Ifill is a Vernon Jordan Endowed Chair in Civil Rights at Howard University. She's also former president, director, counsel, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and she joins me now. Sherrilyn, you've built a career in the highest echelons of American law. I think have a very clear-eyed view of the failings of what we call the rule of law, but also the fact that it does exist in this country in a recognizable form. So how do you view the threats here, the sort of open aspirations to kind of tear the whole tower down?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I take them very seriously. Trump has been on a learning curve about the power of the presidency since he took office. You'll remember that if you read the Mueller report, you would know that when the special counsel was appointed, Trump was absolutely petrified. He said, that's it. I'm done. I'm going to jail. He thought for sure this was not going to work out for him. As he began to learn about the Department of Justice memos against, prosecuting a sitting president, as he learned about some of the norms and ethics that bound some of the lawyers, he became more and more outrageous. Trump believes that he's a TV character, so he believes he can fire the attorney general if he doesn't like the attorney general. And he did fire the attorney general. He fired Jeff Sessions because Jeff Sessions recused himself from the probe that was looking into Trump. So he wants to do that. He wants to have control over all of the agencies. He wants to abolish the Department of Education. He wants to ensure that there are no protests against his government. And he constantly says they know how to handle this in China. Those generals know how to handle protesters. When protest is one of the core activities of democratic citizenship. He also said that people who are criticizing conservative Supreme Court justices should be jailed for the way they talk about justices. So he's feeling even more powerful. And we mustn't forget that part of the reason he is feeling this muscular is because the Supreme Court, in its shocking and appalling decision that essentially set the president above the rule of law, has said that what he does in office, if they are, quote unquote, official acts, are not capable of being prosecuted even after he leaves office. So now he is feeling even more emboldened. And of course, Trump believes that if he is elected, he will never leave office.
Yeah, that point about the point about the immunity decision is really important. And one of the things I've been trying to do is sort of be very clear-eyed and specific about these powers and where to me the propensity for abuse. So like on tariffs, I think he's very serious, and the statutes at issue give him tremendous flexibility to be like Trump tax on all imported goods day one. On deportation, again, he's imbued with pre-existing authority. But it's on this third thing that I wanted to ask you about because, again, as a civil rights attorney, you know the particular power of the prosecutorial power of the government and how liable to abuse it can be, even under good circumstances. and the aspiration he had in the first term that was largely stymied, not entirely, to use it purely as a tool. And what that looks like in a second term, particularly given the kind of weird green light from John Roberts in that opinion.
Yeah, Chris, I think this is the most concerning point, and you've hit the nail on the head. You know, after the uprising in Ferguson, you'll remember that there were many groups from my own community clamoring for President Obama to go to Ferguson. And President Obama refused to go to Ferguson, and I met with him along with other civil rights leaders during that time, because there was a Department of Justice investigation happening that was being led by Eric Holder, and the president didn't want to look like he was putting a thumb on the scale. So some of this is about, like, norms and ethics. We know that Trump has none of that. And the way I read the Supreme Court's decision in the immunity case, they seemed to really remove the idea that there was something inappropriate, unlawful, or unseemly about the president directing the attorney general to engage in certain kinds of prosecutions. And we know now from New York Times reporting that this was something Trump did incessantly. He incessantly asked his aides to investigate and to try and prosecute people he perceived as his enemies. So we are in real trouble if we think about a second Trump term. And what Trump has also ratcheted up, Chris, is his explicit racism, because he sees that there are no consequences or accountability for it. And he also sees the signals coming from the Supreme Court about race. So I am deeply and profoundly concerned. We should remember that some of the consequences of Trump's actions and words are not about government apparatus. They're about the 20% rise in hate crimes that occurred during his presidency, and the language that he unleashed, and the sense of violence that he unleashed in the population that we all experienced. And that is very real in the lives of people who are going to be affected by it.